Hello and welcome back to Flipped Psychology. I'm Miss Lee. In this video, we're going to be completing Unit 4, Lifespan Development. Our video today is on Section 4, Adult Development. We have two objectives today. We're going to describe the major physical, cognitive, and social changes that accompany adulthood and aging, and we're going to examine issues related to the end of life. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes, and let's get started. So what are some characteristics and issues of young adulthood? There are some key tasks that we tend to focus on when we are in young adulthood. The first is we tend to reassess what course of life that we've chosen. So is this working? Do we like what we're doing? Are we on track for our career? There's an urge to settle down when we're in our 30s. Sometimes that's earlier, sometimes that's later, but this tends to be what we see. And then usually there is some type of a formation of marriage or intimate relationships. This could be of a romantic nature, or we really do kind of firm up our intimate relationships with friends. So again, there's reassessment, there's settling down, and then there's marriage and intimate relationships. The next stage is middle adulthood, and there are, again, some predictable characteristics and issues faced in middle adulthood. We talked about this in the developmental theorist video. Generativity. This is the ability to create, originate, and produce. So being able to be productive is something that is very important in middle adulthood usually. Sometimes we see this as a transitional period. A transition is a period when people's perspectives change in a major way, and it usually happens somewhere in the early to mid 40s. Again, there is some flexibility with this age range, but this is something that we do tend to see in middle adulthood. And then something that adults tend to face in their middle adulthood, in their middle ages, is an empty nest syndrome. This is feelings of emptiness and loss that mothers and fathers sometimes feel after their children have left home. And this is very much related to this period of transition that we talked about just a few moments ago. So moving on to late adulthood. How do people's lives change in late adulthood? Well, there are definitely some notable physical changes. Usually adults have kind of noticed this all along, but this is where there is typically a steep decline, wrinkles, skin folds, and a decline in senses, especially smell, as well as slower reflexes. There are some cognitive changes. It's not that everyone has dementia, but the sense of memory does sometimes decline, as well as being able to problem solve very quickly. Social changes sometimes arise, and these are decisions usually related to retirement or where someone should live. As these physical changes start kind of compiling, it may not be reasonable to live alone or at home anymore. And then there are some very distinct emotional and cultural issues that we're going to go into more detail in the next slide. These emotional and cultural issues include shifting focus away from work. Typically, this is the period of time when an adult stops working or retires. Up until this point, a huge portion of their life may have been focusing on work. So what do you do after that? They have to learn with physical changes. So what do you do with this difference in abilities? You tend to, because of the shift away from work, maybe you're spending more time with your spouse and you're learning, kind of relearning how to do that. And at times the adult is adjusting to a spouse's illness or death. And this can bring on feelings of loneliness, grief, and stress. So what are some attitudes and issues related to death and dying? There are a couple of terms that I want you to be familiar with. First is hospice. This is a place where someone who typically has a terminal illness or is not expected to live much longer is going to go and spend potentially the rest of their lives being made comfortable. They're not really looking for a cure at this point. They're not expecting a cure, but the focus is really to be more comfortable. Euthanasia is a term here in the United States, a lot of controversy about assisted suicide, but euthanasia is the term that is basically being assisted in the process of dying. Typically, this is done when someone has a terminal illness. There are steps and and only a handful of states allow this. The idea of a living will, this is where someone is basically stating their wishes about their end of life. Couple other points. The funeral, this is something that usually reflects religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, and it's an opportunity for the family to really go through part of the grieving process. And this brings us to bereavement. This is kind of a formal way of saying the mourning process. This is definitely a part of grieving. So when we're talking about death and dying, one of our key researchers who really revolutionized the ideas related to death and dying was Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. And she came up with some stages. And I'm kind of emphasizing the fact that they're not true stages like we have seen so far. They aren't necessarily in any order. You can circle back and go through them. You can go through several of these periods at once. You may be familiar with some of these stages. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. So how Elizabeth Kübler-Ross conducted her research was she interviewed people who were dying, and this was something that was revolutionary. No one had really done this before. It was kind of considered taboo. It was something that people felt very uncomfortable talking about. They thought that by talking about it, it would make the person feel worse. And so she interviewed people. She interviewed people in front of audiences and students. And on your screen, you see kind of the grief cycle according to Kübler-Ross. This includes, again, those 5 stages, and they're quasi-stages. They're not really like your typical stage theory that we've talked about so far. These are some of the other emotions that can be kind of lumped in with those primary stages. So denial can include avoidance, confusion, elation, shock, fear. Anger can include frustration, irritation, anxiety. Bargaining is struggling to find meaning, reaching out to others, telling one's story. Depression can include feelings of being overwhelmed, helplessness, hostility, or feelings of wanting to take flight. And then last but not least is acceptance. This is where you explore options, you have a new plan in place, and you begin to move forward, move on. Again, someone can go through several of these stages at once. They can go back through, they can hit acceptance and then have a period of feeling very angry. So there's a lot of fluidity in these stages. So just before we go, let's talk about what we covered in this video. We described the major physical, cognitive, and social changes that accompany adulthood and aging, and we examined issues related to the end of life. And that is it for Unit 4. We will begin a new unit in our next video. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.